Matthew Bruenig is the founder of the People's Policy Project, and I have to admit, his work actually did guide me into the right direction in understanding some of the flaws in Warren's financing plan. And Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let me just say, I heard your debate about Medicare for All versus a public option with, I believe it was Ezra Klein.
Yeah, on his podcast.
Yeah, so you know your stuff, and I'm really grateful that you were one of the first to put out a pretty solid critique on the Medicare head tax. So I talked about it previously in a segment, but I was hoping you could kind of flesh that out a little more, during this interview.
Yeah, so when you're creating a Medicare financing proposal, you basically do three things. The first thing you do is you bring in existing government spending. That gets you about 55 to 60% of the money you need. Then the next thing you do is you throw out as many sort of rich people taxes as you can, capital gains, wealth tax, on and on. And then after you've done that, there's still more money to get. And that's step three, the kind of middle class taxes, if you will. And there are a number of ways to do that. The most conventional way to do it is you use a mix of income and payroll taxes. Which are taxes that are levied based on your income. So the higher your income, the more you pay. Warren decided to depart from that norm and use a head tax, which is just a flat dollar amount. It doesn't matter if you make $10,000 a year or $200,000 a year, you're gonna pay the same amount. Now she levies that on the employer. The employer is the one who's actually, they're gonna take the money out of their bank account and give it to the IRS. But anything you charge on an employer in that kind of way really comes out of workers' pockets. So it is sort of the most regressive tax you could use for that kind of step three of the funding process.
Yeah, so I find it interesting how differently she has made the political calculations, especially when you juxtapose her answers on middle class taxes to Bernie Sanders's answers. Now, Bernie's been pretty straightforward. Yes, middle class taxes are gonna go up, but overall costs are gonna go down. And by being frank, he's avoided being cornered the same way that Senator Warren has been cornered. And in reality, and this is just my opinion, I feel as though she's setting herself up for failure, similar to how Obama set himself up for failure when it came to the Affordable Care Act. He claimed you get to keep your private insurer. If you like your insurer, don't worry about it. Now, as we know, many people did lose their private insurer, even if it got replaced with better insurance. In the case of Elizabeth Warren, I think that she's calculated that Americans aren't gonna somehow notice that these taxes are gonna be passed on to middle class employees.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. The employer head tax is what's called an indirect tax. So it doesn't come out of your paycheck. It is paid before the money has a chance to get into your paycheck. And the idea is that maybe you won't notice something like that. I don't know if people will or won't notice it, but it is still something you pay, even if in theory, or even if in the way it's implemented, it falls on the employer. And the other calculation here is, you can kind of say this all day long, and the question is, it only works as long as no one else calls you out on it. And it's just hard to believe that, Biden or Buttigieg or anyone else who can see this, and it's so clear if you know what you're doing when you're thinking about taxes. It's hard to see that they're just going to play along and not hit you with the same stuff they were hitting you with. Except now you're committed to saying, nope, not a middle class tax, not a middle class tax. Right. Whereas you should have been saying what Bernie was saying, which is like, yeah, okay, taxes will go up a little, but your other costs go down so much. It's more money for you. Right. The taxes are bad because it means you have less money, but you're gonna have more money after that. Like that's at least honest, and no one can hit you on it.
So talk to me a little bit about whether you buy into Warren's sincerity in backing Medicare for All. Before she put out her financing plan, I was skeptical about it, but based on her summary of Medicare for All in that Medium post, it does appear that she is supportive of Medicare for All. But am I naive in thinking that? Because I do see some on the left who are still skeptical, even though she has taken a pretty big political risk in sharing how she would finance the legislation.
Yeah, with politicians, it's always very difficult to know what they believe and what they don't believe. You could say, well, she's been in the Senate for many, many years, and she only signed on to Medicare for all in, I think it was 2017, at which point she was presumably planning on running for president. Well, why didn't she sign on before then? So I mean, there are a lot of things you can do to try to figure out what a politician really believes. And there are other ways in which you could say many politicians don't believe very much, or they have a few issues they care about and they kind of are open to whatever on other issues.
Yeah.
And so,
Well, Senator Sanders had put out options for financing Medicare for all. I don't even know how long ago. I just know that it's been available online for quite some time now. But the way that Warren has really spun this is to make it appear as though she's the only candidate who's really thought about the financing options. And so, look, part of my problem with Sanders is that he doesn't really fight back hard enough, right? I mean, he's the man who wrote the bill. He has put out financing options, and he's kind of allowed her to make this nonsense point and make it appear as though he hasn't even thought about financing it, when in reality he has. Am I fair in my interpretation of what's going on here? Because I really do think that he needs to, at this point, draw a line in the sand and say, hey, you know what? These aren't issues that I just thought of yesterday. This is something that I've been working on for quite some time now. It's a well thought out policy, and there are several options in how to finance it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Sanders treats Warren with kid gloves, I would say, and I think that comes out of a genuine, he likes Warren, and Warren, I like Warren too. I mean, there's a lot to like there, but I mean, you also have to realize that she's kind of throwing punches at you, even if she might be a little more diplomatic about it. What they're telling press here is, our plan doesn't raise middle class taxes. Bernie does. I know what I'm doing. Bernie doesn't. Like, that is what the messaging is. And at some point, if someone is throwing punches at you, you might need to throw some back.
So one thing that did stand out to me is how different they are in their approach to accomplish Medicare for all. Because on one hand, you have Bernie Sanders, who says that he would not do away with the filibuster, but Warren says that she absolutely would do away with the filibuster. She would fight the filibuster in order to ensure passage in the Senate. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Bernie has a kind of interesting position on the filibuster. He sometimes says he won't get rid of the filibuster, but by that he means he's going to force people to stand up and talk like endlessly. And so in essence, the filibuster as we know it would be gotten rid of, because people can't talk for more than maybe 20 hours at a time. And then other times he's said that he'll keep the filibuster, but to determine whether something can be passed through reconciliation, it's the vice president that actually determines that through the rules of the Senate. And so he would just have his vice president say Medicare for all can be passed through reconciliation, which means you only need 51 votes. So he sort of toys with saying, oh, I'm going to respect the filibuster, but then also says things that make it seem like he's in effect going to gut it anyways.
And then one final question for you. This race, the progressive race between Sanders and Warren, I think has put a lot of people like me in a bad place, because while I'm definitely supportive of Sanders, he's the candidate that I've endorsed, at the same time, it feels as though there's a lot of pressure from some on social media to be almost like vicious toward Warren, and I don't think that that's good in terms of like a long-term strategy. How have you handled that divide, and how do we kind of contain it in a way where we're debating the issues, we're debating the policies? I think that's important to come up with the best solutions and the best financing options. But at the same time, I mean, tearing apart other members of the left, I just don't think is the right way to go about it.
Yeah, elections are difficult because it's an inherently antagonistic thing, and but you might not necessarily hate the opponent. So I try to stick to policy. Everything that goes on people's policy project is very, at least I try to keep it very much like, here's some graphs, here's some numbers, here's the problem, without necessarily tearing down the person. And I've written some criticisms of Bernie policies as well. So that's how I try to do it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Stick to the policy, try to avoid character assassination based on speculation. There's been a lot of that on social media. My support for Bernie is 100% due to his policy proposals and honestly, how frank he is on what needs to be done to get those policy proposals funded. And so I always appreciate that. But I think Warren has put out some good policies as well. Matthew Bruenig, thank you so much for joining us on No Filter. I hope you'll come back again.
Thank you.